is on Margaret Atwood's novel *The Handmaid's Tale*, analyzing the rise of the right-wing fascist government that comes in the story in relationship to Nazi Germany and Islamic fundamentalism. So my thesis is called As the Day Turns to Night because a recurring theme is that this transition happens extremely slowly, and it's really not noticeable until it's already too late. And I have a quote before every section. So before the introduction I have, "Nothing changes instantaneously in a gradually heating bathtub. You'd be boiled to death before you knew it." Reminiscent of how slowly the change occurs. So I'm going to use the words fascist, authoritarian, and totalitarian almost interchangeably, but they don't mean the same thing, but they do all describe the government. Fascism is marked with preoccupation with community decline, cults of unity and purity, and a large nationalist group of militants. While totalitarianism is a political system where social ties are replaced by a state-imposed organization, and everyone only acts for the goals of the government. And then finally, authoritarianism prefers conformity to authority and norms within groups. And before I get going, I'm going to explain what other words in the story mean. So whenever the government of Gilead sets up, women and men are divided into strict social classes. So men can be involved in lower levels in the military, they can be part of the spy group, they can be sort of a middle class, or they can be commanders, men who were involved in setting up the government, as well as controlling the military. Now commanders have wives, and if those commanders and wives cannot have children, which they blame exclusively on women, they are issued a handmaid, a woman who goes by of and then the name of the man. So for example, the protagonist in The Handmaid's Tale goes by Offred, because she belongs to Fred, and her job is to produce children for that man. And then other women are Marthas, who are like housekeepers, and then there are Econo wives, who are that middle class. So the 4 stages are a chaotic existence before the existence of the government. Then a right-wing group comes up and uses previous structures of morality, like religion, specifically in The Handmaid's Tale, Christianity, to gain authority. And then they build off a form of prejudice, like sexism, already existing in the time before, build off of that and use it to establish their goals. And then after that, they divide and conquer the oppressed groups, turning them in on each other so that they can enforce their power. So the first step, as I said, is chaos. Aunt Lydia, aunts are the ones who teach the handmaids how to be handmaids, said we were a society dying of too much choice. So there was a lot of chaos happening. No one felt safe. And Offred talks about this, how women have these unspoken rules on how to stay safe. Don't open doors to strangers, always make sure if he says he's a policeman, check his ID, don't stop on the road to help anyone, keep the locks on, don't turn to look at anyone who catcalls you. And the women who didn't follow these rules were killed, and there were stories of women who were bludgeoned to death, mutilated, and their bodies were dropped in the woods. So it's very easy to feel unsafe in this time, and because of that, people are just clamoring for something to make them feel safe. They want something to make them feel secure, and so they're vulnerable to an ideology that professes extreme authoritarianism, like the one I've mentioned before, that eventually takes over. Even later on in the book, as Offred is walking down the street, she remembers that now nothing happens like that. No one's yelling at them from the street, no one's trying to touch them. And people are extremely vulnerable in this state. And moreover, there are different kinds of chaos, not specifically just for women. There's pollutants all around in the air, there are multiple nuclear power plants that explode, and no one feels secure. And because no one feels secure, no one wants to have children. And that continues on. Moreover, because of this chaos, there are 2 groups. There is an extremely feminist group, which Offred's mother is a part of, and there's the group which later comes into power, and they're clashing, and it turns into violence. One woman who works for the extremely conservative group is bombed, or there's an attempt made on her life with a bomb in her car. And no one feels secure, and because no one feels secure, no one has children. And then in addition to that, because of the radiation in the air and all the pollutants, the fertility rate starts dropping to about 25%. 25% of babies are healthy. So no one feels safe. And because of that, this right-wing group comes in and says, well, it's the women's fault. We can blame them. And they use women as a scapegoat so that they can gain power. And they say, well, if we just control women's sexuality and we control who they are and who they sleep with and their ability to have children and force them to have children, then we can fix this issue. And because people are so vulnerable and they're just looking for something to fix their problems, they fall to that. Now, no one thinks it's an issue. That's one of the problems with this. In fact, Serena Joy, who becomes the wife to Offred's commander, she's a huge ideologue for the conservative movement, and she was on TV for a long time before that. So Offred and her husband Luke are watching it, and Luke thinks she's funny. She's entertaining, but she's honest. She's a little frightening, according to Offred. And this ideology only starts to spread and only gains traction because people like Offred and Luke do nothing. They sit there and they watch and they laugh. And this mirrors the rise of Nazism. A long time ago, in Germany in the 30s, whenever it was still called the Weimar Republic, there was a huge amount of inflation. Things cost millions of dollars, just basic toys. It was cheaper to play with money than with toys. So everyone feels extremely unsafe because of this economic unsurety. And then the Great Depression hits, making it worse. And you can see that whenever they go to election times before the Great Depression, the Nazis only won 2.6% of the popular vote. But after the Great Depression only makes their situation worse, they get 18.3% of the vote, and then it slowly rises until they get the majority. And because this ideology is formed in chaos, it has to have chaos to survive. They have to perpetuate a war so that they can stay in power. And what they do is anytime someone doesn't fit the ideology, they hang them on the wall. And people who are attacked are people who don't subscribe to their version of Christianity, so even Baptists and Catholics. People who aren't Christian at all, like Jewish people, are killed. And people who were doctors who would abort babies in the time before, as well as gay people. And this also is very similar to what the Taliban does in Afghanistan. They'll publicly execute people. So they use that chaos to get them closer to this ideology. So next is building. What they do is they take traditional values, they take previous existing moral structures like religion, and they use it for their power. And what they straight up lie about what's in the Bible, and they restrict it. Women are no longer allowed to read. Bibles are kept locked up. So they can say whatever they want is in the Bible without it. So they first build their authority on the story of Rachel. And Rachel was married to Jacob, and she couldn't bear any children, so she gave her maid Bilhah to Jacob to have children. And so they used that to create the system where handmaids are treated as property. They're treated as incubators rather than people. And this actually directly contradicts other biblical passages that say men should only be intimate with their wives. And wives are allowed to hit handmaids, even though Jesus says to turn the other cheek and not strike back. And then from that, they actually begin to insert and remove passages that support their ideology. So they say that St. Paul writes from each according to her ability to each according to his needs, but that's actually a very popular Karl Marx quote. And they use that so that they can send women to the commanders to use as incubators. And they also change the Beatitudes. They say, blessed are the meek. They don't say anything about inheriting the earth. They don't say that anyone who is merciful or silent or meek will be victorious in the time to come. All they say is that those qualities are good, because if they can breed handmaids and breed women to be silent and meek, they can control them and create a society where men are over women and they have more authority. And the Taliban also does this. They misinterpret Islamic text to support violence and ill will towards other people. This is chapter 3. This is conquer. Conquer is kind of the final step. As soon as they can do this, they're really in power. And what they do is they define women by their womanhood and define men by their manhood in order to support their goals. So Offred is in the bath one day, and she doesn't look at her body, not because it's immodest, not because it's shameful, but because it defines her so completely. She has become only her uterus. She serves no other purpose. So they build off existing prejudices, and Offred's husband, Luke, in the time before would make jokes about how like men needed more meat and were stronger, and women weren't capable of high levels of thought. And it was really a joke, but it actually isn't a joke, because if you can normalize saying those kinds of things, if you can normalize those thought processes, then other people can build on them. And if no one stops them, then it grows until you get a government like Gilead in power, because everyone agrees and no one's done anything. And it was similar in Nazi Germany. Anti-Semitism existed before, and what the Nazis did is they built on it. People who didn't like Jewish people beforehand would turn, and then as they gained power, that ideology became more common and it spread. So then they use the prejudice to control women's lives. They build off of it and then they use it. And so women who cannot reproduce or cannot have healthy children are demonized. They're called sluts, they're called whores, because and then women who maybe are moral and cannot do so are called defeated women because they cannot have children. They define women by their ability to reproduce. And another thing is that women bear all the responsibility for men's actions. So this woman named Janine, who also becomes a handmaid, tells a story of how she was raped. She was gang raped at 14 and had an abortion. And instead of saying, well, it was these men's fault, it was the men's fault. They weren't committed to the ideology, they weren't committed to caring about women. They say it was her fault. They say that she was the one who enticed the men. She was the one who caused this thing to happen, and God used that to teach her. So they're defining women by their womanhood as the smarter sex, as the more mature sex, but they're making them take the blame for everything and be more responsible. And men are allowed to go free and do as they will. So Nazi Germany also had a similar program to the Handmaids. They would take women and train them, they would pay the equivalent of about $600 today, and they would go and train to be the perfect wives to an SS officer. And it's a very similar process of women taking on this role of responsibility and taking on the stereotypes and doing what they can to support the government and have children. And women are just incubators in Gilead. That's all they are. And this is the final chapter. This is conquering. So what they do to prevent any uprising, they take any control away from women and then they give it to other women and other people. So there'll be a classified structure of people controlling each other within the minority group. So within women there are aunts, and aunts teach the handmaids how to be handmaids. They spread the ideology, they tell them what to do. So basically to get rid of any possibility of rebellion, they set this up. Aunts always say things like, think of it as being in an army, yours is a position of honor, but their women are just being treated as property. They're just incubators. It's a high level of indoctrination. Aunts are, after being indoctrinated, are the ones who are responsible for teaching others and spreading it. But it's kind of tricky because you think, well, why would these women want to do this? Why would women want to hurt other women? And it's because aunts have extreme benefits. They are the only ones allowed to not be married. They don't have to fully subscribe to the ideology. They have to spread it, but they personally aren't monitored as heavily. And they can read and write. They're the only women allowed to do so. And moreover, there are other stratifications, which I've already talked about. The wives and Marthas, and they don't like the other handmaids. The Marthas often think badly of handmaids because handmaids volunteer for their position, and they think that they're awful people, and they're pious, and they're hurting other women by doing this and subscribing to this. And the wives think awfully because these women come into their homes and have sex with their husbands, destroying their life and their control over the home. And whenever Offred comes to her house for the first time, the wife stands there and she doesn't let Offred come in through the main door because she doesn't like her. And so what the government has done successfully is prevented any uprising because these women don't see each other as other people, as other women. They see them as competitors, and in doing so they remove any possibility of any uprising. This is very similar to Islamic fundamentalism. Women also receive leadership roles in this. So they can manage women's programs, they can be responsible for leading raids and brothels, and they can spread the ideology. And this is very similar to the aunt's position. And what it also has successfully done is with two ideologies who repress women's identities and make them less than people, they give some women just enough benefits to keep the system in place, and in doing so, cement their power. So I'm just going to have one more closing quote, and this is the ending. Whenever Alfred is being fired, along with all the other women, after the government takes power, the man in charge says, "I'm sorry, but it's a law. I have to let you all go." And whenever Alfred questions him, he said, "You can't work in here anymore. It's the law. There's nothing I can do." He keeps repeating this, "There's nothing I can do." But the reality is, there were plenty of things he could do. In the years and years before, The Handmaid's Tale never gives a time frame for the time before. He could have said something. Anytime someone said something sexist, anytime someone said something in support of this group, he could have done something and prevented this whole cycle, because at every stage, you can stop it by intervening. But he didn't. And that's the point of this book. You can always stop it. You can always say something. And when no one does, this is what happens. Thank you.